Hello there, welcome to Nighttime Stories. I hope you've had a wonderful day. Was it amazing or just okay? Drop a rating from 1 to 10 in the comments. Now it's time to unwind. I'm here to help you drift off into a peaceful sleep. Before you get cozy, I'd love for you to like this video and subscribe. It helps bring more bedtime stories your way. Also, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, take a deep breath, relax, and let's begin. I always knew something was wrong with my sister. Not in a cruel way, not in a she's crazy way, just different. She was always a little offbeat, a little too sensitive, a little too lost in her own head. When we were kids, she had imaginary friends way longer than normal. She'd talk to them for hours, whispering in corners, pausing to listen like someone was actually answering her. We thought it was just a phase. It wasn't. By the time she was 14, the conversations had turned into paranoia. She'd tell me about voices whispering in the walls, shadows moving in places they shouldn't. I shrugged it off. I was her older brother. That's what I did. She was my little sister, my responsibility, and I wasn't about to encourage whatever was happening in her head. My parents, though, they were worried. They took her to doctors, therapists, specialists. Words like psychosis, auditory hallucinations, and delusional thinking were thrown around. They put her on medication. It worked mostly, until she stopped taking it. Now she's 17, I'm 19, and our family is just trying to hold things together. We live in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind with neatly trimmed hedges, old streetlights that flicker at night, and a long, winding road that stretches into nothing. The houses are close together but distant in feeling. We have neighbors, but they keep to themselves, the kind of people who close their blinds when they see something strange. At night, it feels empty, too quiet. Sometimes I stand outside on the porch and just listen. There's no traffic, no dogs barking, just the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. But my sister, she hears more than that. She sleeps in the room across the hall from me. It's small, cluttered, full of half-finished paintings, stacks of books, and notebooks with unreadable scribbles she never lets me see. Our parents work late, a lot. It's just the two of us most nights. And lately, she's been getting worse. It started with footsteps. Not real ones, at least. Not that I ever heard. One night, she knocked on my door looking pale. I think someone's in the house. I sighed, rubbing my eyes. You didn't take your meds, did you? She shook her head quickly. No, listen, I hear them every night, pacing outside my room. I sat up. Mom and Dad, they're not home. I frowned, listening. Silence. No footsteps. No creaking, just the quiet hum of the house settling. She bit her lip, arms crossed over herself. It sounds like someone walking up and down the hall, over and over. I stood up, walked past her, and checked. Nothing. See? It's fine. She hesitated before mumbling. It stops when you come out. I rolled my eyes. Go to bed. You're freaking yourself out. She didn't look convinced, but she didn't argue either. I should have paid attention to how tired she looked, how the dark circles under her eyes had deepened. Instead, I just went back to sleep. The next night, she heard whispers. She banged on my door, frantic this time. There's someone outside my window. I groaned. Seriously. She grabbed my wrist, pulling me toward her room. I looked out. Nothing. The street was empty, the houses dark, the sky a murky black with no moon. There was a voice, she insisted, right outside my window. A man. He was whispering my name. I rubbed my temples. It's in your head, okay? You have to take your meds. She shook her head, stepping back. I know what I heard. You don't, I said, harsher than I meant. It's the same thing every time, and it's never real. Just go to bed. She looked at me with an expression I couldn't place. It wasn't anger. It was fear. The noises got worse. 3 nights later, I found her sitting in the living room at 3 a.m., hugging her knees, staring at the ceiling. The walls are breathing, she whispered. I sighed. They're not. She squeezed her eyes shut. You don't understand. She wouldn't go back to her room that night. She slept on the couch. I didn't push her. I figured it was one of her episodes. I figured she'd be fine. Then last night, I woke up to the sound of her door creaking open. Not a knock. Not her calling my name. Just the slow, quiet groan of wood bending under movement. I sat up, rubbing my face. What now? No answer. I sighed and stood, stepping into the hallway. Her door was open. Her room was dark. I hesitated, feeling a weird, uneasy chill crawl up my spine. She was sitting on the edge of her bed, completely still, her back to me. I frowned. Hey, you okay? She didn't move. I walked closer, cautiously. Did you hear something again? She nodded, barely. What was it? She turned her head slightly, just enough for me to see her face in the dim glow from the hallway. She looked distant, like she was listening. Inside, she whispered. I felt cold. Inside what? She swallowed. The cupboard. My eyes flicked to the old wooden cabinet in the corner of her room. She never used it. It was practically empty. But something about it. The door was slightly ajar, like it had been opened just a crack. I exhaled sharply, rubbing the back of my neck. There's nothing in there. She shook her head. Something's inside. I sighed, forcing myself to act normal. I didn't want to feed her delusions. So I walked up to the cupboard, grabbed the handle, and pulled it open. Empty. I turned back to her. See? She finally looked at me and whispered, He's hiding. I didn't sleep much after that. I told myself it was just in her head, that she needed to be back on her meds, that it was just another bad night. But something about the way she said it, so calm, so certain, stuck with me. And tonight I'm hearing things too. I woke up to the sound of breathing. Slow, uneven. Not my sister's. Not mine. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The air in my room felt thicker, like I was suddenly hyper-aware of how alone I was. I turned my head toward the hallway. The breathing wasn't coming from my room. It was coming from hers. I sat up, listening. It was faint, just past the edge of hearing, like someone trying not to make noise. Then a soft creak. My stomach dropped. I threw off the blanket and stood, moving carefully, slowly. The floorboards barely groaned under my weight as I stepped into the hallway. Her bedroom door was open. Not wide, just a few inches, as if it had been pushed open gently. A dim glow from outside crept through her window, casting shadows along the walls. And then I saw it. The cupboard door, slightly ajar, open just a crack. The breathing was coming from inside. I wanted to believe it was her. I wanted to believe she was just having another episode, sitting inside like a child hiding from the dark. But then I heard her. She was in bed. She whispered, voice shaking, "James, he's inside." I felt my skin crawl. I wanted to run. I wanted to grab her, drag her out of that room and lock the door behind us. But I didn't move, because at that moment, the breathing changed. It wasn't quiet anymore. It was closer, louder, like whoever or whatever was inside the cupboard had just realized we were awake, and was now listening to us. The next sound I heard wasn't breathing. It was a shift, a slow, deliberate adjustment. The sound of bare skin dragging against wood. My hands clenched into fists. I reached out, barely whispering, "Stay behind me." She grabbed onto my wrist, squeezing so tightly I could feel her nails digging into my skin. I stepped forward. Every instinct screamed at me not to open it. But I did. The cupboard door swung open. And he was there. A tall, naked man, crouched inside, knees pressed up against his chest. He was too thin, his ribs protruding beneath pale, sickly skin, his arms too long, fingers curled like claws. His eyes snapped to mine, wide, unblinking, hollow. And then he smiled. Not like someone caught in the act, not embarrassed. A slow, stretched grin. A grin that said, "I've been waiting for you to find me." For one horrible second, we just stared at each other. My brain refused to make sense of what I was seeing. Then he spoke. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper, like he hadn't spoken in weeks. "Austin," he rasped. My blood turned to ice. His body twitched violently, like he was trying to unfold himself from the cramped space. Then he lunged. I don't remember grabbing my sister. I don't remember turning and running. But suddenly, we were in the hallway, slamming her bedroom door behind us. The sound of bare feet slapping against the floor sent terror straight through me. I could hear him moving fast. I shoved my sister toward the stairs. "Run." She hesitated for a second too long, because at that moment, the bedroom door slammed open. Grandma was awake. She stormed out of her room, hair wild, fury in her eyes. And without a second of hesitation, she charged. "Get out of my house." I'd never seen her move so fast. And he froze. For the first time, the man looked afraid. Grandma grabbed the nearest thing, a lamp, and swung it. The base cracked against his ribs. The smile disappeared. He stumbled backward, scrambling for the door. And then he ran. The cops came 20 minutes later. They searched the whole neighborhood. No sign of him. Nothing except handprints on the inside of the cupboard, as if he had been pressing against it every night, listening, waiting. We found out later that the back door had been unlocked. And that cupboard? It had a false panel in the back. He had been hiding behind the wall. How long had he been in there? Days, Weeks? Had he been the one whispering at night? Had he been watching my sister sleep? Had he been waiting for something? Waiting for Austin? I don't know. And I don't want to. We moved out. Grandma changed the locks before selling the house. We never talked about it again. My sister started taking her meds again. She sleeps fine now. But me? I still wake up in the middle of the night, feeling like something is watching me. Like something is hiding, listening, waiting. I never liked my grandma's house. It wasn't that it was dirty or cluttered or smelled of old people like some might expect. No, it was just too quiet. Located on the edge of town, her house sat alone at the end of a long gravel road, surrounded by an overgrown garden that she insisted was natural and full of character. To me, it just looked like something hiding places. The house itself was a small two-story cottage. The kitchen and living room took up most of the downstairs, with a conservatory attached to the back, full of dusty armchairs and creeping ivy. The conservatory had glass walls giving an open view of the garden, which stretched into the darkness. Upstairs, my grandma's bedroom was on the left, with a small guest bedroom on the right, where I was staying for the night. The only bathroom was at the end of the hall. It wasn't a big place, but it felt empty in a way that didn't feel right. I was staying the night because my grandma, a tough 61-year-old woman who still fixed her own plumbing and refused to ask for help, had asked me to help with some repairs the next morning. I agreed, thinking I'd get a warm meal and a good night's sleep out of it. I was wrong. I heard the first noise around 10:30 p.m. Grandma had gone upstairs to get ready for bed, leaving me in the living room, watching television. I had the volume low, but even over it, I could hear a faint rustling noise coming from the conservatory. At first, I thought it was the wind pushing against the glass, maybe some branches scratching at the windows. But as I muted the television and listened closer, the sound became a soft tapping, like fingertips against the glass. I turned to look. The conservatory was dark, barely illuminated by the light from the living room. The glass walls reflected the room back at me, making it hard to see outside. But I had the unshakable feeling that someone was out there. I told myself it was just a tree branch and went back to watching television. I must have fallen asleep because the next thing I knew, I woke up to a creaking sound. It was slow, rhythmic, deliberate. I blinked, disoriented, the television screen now dimmed. The creaking was coming from upstairs, followed by a soft whispering. I sighed, rubbing my face. It had to be Grandma on the phone. She had a habit of talking to her sister late at night, pacing around her room while she gossiped. But something felt off. The whispers were too quiet, like they weren't meant to be heard, and the creaking, it wasn't the normal pattern of pacing footsteps. It sounded like someone rocking back and forth. I sat up slowly, trying not to make a sound. The house was cold. My skin prickled as I stood and crept toward the staircase. The whispering continued. I stepped into the hallway, peering up the stairs. The creaking stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, a sharp, wet whisper came from the darkness above. "Austin, where is Austin?" I froze. That wasn't Grandma's voice. A shadow shifted at the top of the stairs. My heart pounded as I reached for the light switch, flicking it on. And that's when I saw her. She was tall, too tall, at least 6 feet, maybe more. Her body was emaciated, her skin stretched too tightly over her bones, veins webbing across her arms and chest. And she was completely naked. Her head twitched violently as she mumbled to herself, her thin lips moving rapidly, repeating the same question over and over. Austin. Where is Austin? I took a step back. Her head snapped toward me. And then she screamed. It was a raw, guttural sound full of rage and grief, like an animal in pain. She lurched forward, her bare feet slapping against the wood as she lunged toward me. I barely had time to react before I slammed the living room door shut in her face. She hit the door hard, her nails scraping against the wood, her voice rising in a frenzy. Where is Austin? Where is Austin? I stumbled backward, breathless, my hands shaking. And then boom. Something heavy crashed upstairs. Another set of footsteps thundered down the hall. James! It was Grandma. She burst into the room, her nightgown billowing, eyes blazing with fury. Without hesitation, she marched to the door and yanked it open. The woman was still there, panting, hunched over, her eyes wild and sunken. And then, something changed. The second Grandma appeared, the woman's entire body tensed, her eyes widened in terror, and she stumbled backward, her thin arms trembling. Grandma pointed a shaking finger at her, her voice firm. Get out. The woman let out a low, desperate whimper and then she ran. She bolted through the conservatory, her bare feet thudding against the floor, and then out the back door, disappearing into the darkness. The moment she was gone, Grandma turned to me, her expression unreadable. Are you hurt? She asked. I shook my head. She sighed. Lock the doors. We'll talk in the morning. And just like that, she went upstairs, leaving me standing there, shaken and confused. I didn't sleep that night. In the morning, Grandma made breakfast like nothing had happened. I waited until she sat down with her coffee before finally asking, Who the hell was that? Grandma stirred her coffee slowly, as if picking her words carefully. Years ago, she said, a woman used to live in the old house across the field. Her son went missing, Austin, just vanished one day. She never recovered from it. She took a sip of coffee. Some nights, she comes looking for him. I stared at her. That woman, she was alive? Grandma gave me a long, tired look. Of course she was, she said. Wouldn't have run otherwise. I felt cold all over. That meant she was still out there, still wandering the woods, still looking for Austin. And now she knew my name. The day the substitute teacher arrived, it rained so hard the windows rattled. Fourth grade was restless from the moment the bell rang, whispers bouncing off the walls, feet swinging beneath desks, pencils tapping. Rain always did that to kids. It made the air feel thick, the room too small, like energy had nowhere to go but out. When the classroom door finally opened, everyone went quiet. The woman who stepped inside was thin, too thin. Her black skirt clung to sharp angles, and her blouse was pressed so stiffly it barely moved when she did. Her hair was pulled back in a bun so tight it looked painful. She didn't smile, didn't clear her throat, didn't introduce herself. Just walked to the front of the room and started writing on the board. Her handwriting was too perfect. No hesitation, no uneven strokes, just smooth, mechanical letters forming 2 words. Miss Lyle. No good morning, class. No explanation of where Mrs. Collins had gone. Nothing. The silence stretched. A few students glanced at each other, uncertain. Kids could always sense when something wasn't right, even if they couldn't put it into words. I sat at the second to last desk in the row by the window, my backpack still hanging open, forgotten. I didn't know what I had expected, but it wasn't her. I had been in this school since kindergarten, and in all those years, substitute teachers had fit into two categories. Overly enthusiastic, trying too hard to win us over. Checked out, barely doing the job. Miss Lyle was neither. She was empty. I had been staring, and when she turned around, my breath hitched, because she was staring directly at me. Her eyes were the wrong color. Not brown, not blue, not green, just gray flat and dull, like old film. The kind of gray that made you think of broken things. I swallowed and looked down at my desk. When I glanced back up, she had already turned away, moving with precise, measured steps toward the teacher's desk. Her shoes didn't make a sound. She picked up the attendance sheet but didn't call names. She just stood there looking at it, her lips slightly parted like she was reading silently to herself. The whole class sat stiffly in their seats, waiting. Minutes passed. Nothing. The rain hammered harder against the glass. Then, finally, she spoke. Her voice was wrong. It wasn't raspy or too deep or high-pitched. It was just off, flat, hollow, like the words weren't coming from her but from somewhere behind her. Take out your math books. No, please. No, let's begin. Just a command. Chairs scraped against the floor as we obeyed. I turned to the right page, but my hands felt cold, my stomach twisted in knots. She walked between the desks as we worked, passing so quietly I wouldn't have noticed her if I hadn't been watching. She didn't speak, didn't glance at the clock. Just moved. Up and down the aisles. And then I saw it. She never blinked. Not once. Not as she hovered over students, watching them write. Not as she circled the room, pausing behind chairs for a few long silent moments before moving on. The more I noticed, the harder it was to focus. I kept sneaking glances at her out of the corner of my eye. The way her movements were too precise. The way her hands never seemed to fully unclench. And the way she never touched anything. Not the desk, not the board, not the papers. Her hands hovered just above them, like she wasn't quite there. At lunch, the tension in the classroom finally broke. The moment the bell rang, kids bolted from their seats, a few whispering to each other as they disappeared into the hall. I stayed back. She didn't leave with the rest of us. Didn't say we were dismissed. She just stood at the teacher's desk, facing forward, staring. The hair on the back of my neck prickled. I was the last one out. And just before I stepped into the hallway, I made the mistake of looking back. She was still watching me. Her gray eyes locked onto mine, unmoving. I turned and ran. At lunch, the cafeteria buzzed with low chatter, but something was off. Other kids had noticed. "She's weird," Mia whispered, glancing around as if Miss Lyle might be lurking nearby. "Did she even eat anything?" I frowned. "What do you mean?" "I stayed behind to grab my raincoat," she said. She just sat there, no food, no drink, just sitting. Lucas leaned forward. "She didn't even use a computer. When Mrs. Collins is out, the subs always use the login on the teacher's desktop. But I walked past the room and nothing. The screen was black." We fell silent. "She doesn't blink," I muttered. Mia shuddered. "I thought it was just me." Lucas hesitated, then quietly, "I don't think she has a shadow." My skin went cold. I stared at him, waiting for him to say, "Just kidding," to smirk, to turn it into some weird joke. He didn't. I felt suddenly lightheaded, like my stomach had dropped without warning. Because he wasn't lying. I had noticed it tunely, I hadn't let myself believe it. The way she moved through the classroom, past the windows, past the light, past the places where shadows should have stretched. And yet, Nothing followed her. I swallowed hard. We should tell someone. Lucas shook his head. Who? The principal? What are we supposed to say? Hey, we think the sub isn't human. Mia stabbed her fork into her food. Maybe she's just sick, she said, but she didn't sound convinced. I glanced across the cafeteria. At the far end, near the staff tables, a few teachers were talking and laughing over their lunches. They looked normal, real. I couldn't explain it, but I knew whatever Miss Lyle was, she wasn't one of them. A quiet, horrible thought crept into my mind, one that made my skin feel too tight, my throat dry. If she wasn't real, if she wasn't supposed to be here, then where was Mrs. Collins? The bell rang before anyone could say anything else. We stood, gathering our trays, and I hesitated. Something told me I shouldn't go back to class. That I should pretend to be sick, go to the nurse's office, anything but walk back into that room. But I didn't, because deep down I already knew. I already knew that something was waiting for us, and we were about to find out what. The air in the classroom felt wrong when we walked back in. Not cold, not hot, just off, like the kind of stillness that came before a thunderstorm. The fluorescent lights hummed too loudly, flickering just slightly, but maybe that was my imagination. Or maybe it wasn't. Miss Lyle stood at the front of the room, facing the chalkboard, not writing, not adjusting papers, just standing there, like she had been there the entire time waiting. I hesitated by the door, gripping the strap of my backpack. The rest of the class shuffled past me, their voices lower than usual, their movements careful. I glanced at Mia. She avoided my gaze. Lucas did too. Because we all felt it. We knew something wasn't right. And yet we sat down anyway. Miss Lyle finally moved. Slow, deliberate, she turned toward us, her hands still pressed close to her sides. Those gray eyes, flat, emotionless, swept across the room, taking us in one by one. She didn't smile, didn't speak. And then she did something I still can't explain. She tilted her head. Not a normal tilt, not the kind people do when they're curious or confused. It was too slow, too exact, like a machine calculating something. Her neck shouldn't have bent that way. The room felt impossibly quiet. Then, finally, she spoke. Her voice was just as empty as before. Continue working from page 73. Chairs creaked as kids pulled out their books. Pages turned, pencils scratched. Everyone was too afraid to do anything but obey. I flipped open my own textbook, but I wasn't reading. I was watching. She didn't sit at the teacher's desk. She just stood there, watching us. Watching me. I kept my eyes on my book, but I could feel it, that unblinking stare drilling into the side of my face. I tried to ignore it. I tried not to look. But I did. And the moment I glanced up, she moved. Not a normal movement. She didn't step, didn't shift. 1 second, she was at the front of the room. The next, she was behind me. I didn't hear her move. I didn't see it. But she was there, standing inches from my chair. My breath locked in my throat. I couldn't turn around. I couldn't. I stared straight ahead, fingers digging into the edge of my desk. Then, she leaned down, close enough that I felt the air change, the unnatural stillness around her. And in the smallest, quietest voice, she whispered my name. Not out loud. Inside my head, I shot up from my chair so fast it scraped against the floor. The noise shattered the silence, and all eyes snapped toward me. Miss Lyle remained where she was, staring at me with that blank, unreadable face. I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but no words came out. Her gaze stayed locked onto mine, and for the first time I saw it. A flicker of something beneath her skin. A ripple, like static on an old television screen, distorting her features for the briefest second before smoothing out again. I backed away, my breath uneven. Two need to go to the nurse. Miss Lyle didn't react. She didn't nod, didn't ask if I was okay. She just stared. And then, so quietly I almost didn't hear it. She said, "Hurry back." Not a command. A warning. I grabbed my things and ran. I didn't go to the nurse. I went straight to the office. The hallway felt impossibly long as I walked, my mind racing. My legs still felt shaky from whatever had happened back there, my stomach twisting itself into knots. The receptionist barely glanced up when I entered. "Something wrong?" I nodded, my throat dry. "Two need to talk to the principal." Her fingers hovered over her keyboard. "About what?" "The substitute, Miss Lyle." She frowned slightly, tilting her head. "Who?" I swallowed. "The sub, the one covering for Mrs. Collins." A longer pause. Then she glanced at her computer screen, scrolled, checked something. A slow, uneasy expression crossed her face. "We don't have a Miss Lyle on record," she said. My heart stopped. I gripped the counter. "That's not possible. She's in my classroom right now." The receptionist's face paled. "Mrs. Collins never called out today." The words didn't make sense at first. I stood there, frozen, trying to make it make sense. I turned back toward the hallway. The door to my classroom was barely visible at the end of it. Everything inside me screamed to run. Instead, I whispered, "Then who is in my classroom?" The principal called security. I sat in the front office, hands gripping the chair beneath me, my mind spiraling. The hallways were too quiet. The rain outside had stopped. Everything felt suspended, like time was waiting to see what would happen next. 15 minutes passed. Then 20. Finally, the principal returned. Her face was blank, unreadable. There was no one in the classroom. I blinked. "What?" She sat down across from me, folding her hands neatly. The students were sitting quietly at their desks. No teacher present, no sign that one had ever been there. My pulse thundered. "That's not." I shook my head. "That's not possible. She was there. She was just there." A pause. Then, "Are you feeling all right?" I stared at her. Something wasn't right. The way she was looking at me, the way her fingers tapped against the desk too rhythmically. A horrible thought slithered into my mind. I turned toward the receptionist. She was watching me now. So was the janitor by the supply closet, the office aide by the window. Their eyes too still, too expectant. The air in the room shifted. And suddenly, I knew. I wasn't supposed to ask questions. I wasn't supposed to notice. I wasn't supposed to see. Miss Lyle was gone. But something else was still here. Watching. Waiting. And now they knew that I knew. The office was too quiet. The kind of quiet that wasn't empty, but watching. The principal sat across from me, her hands folded neatly on the desk. The receptionist had stopped typing, her fingers hovering just above the keyboard. Even the janitor, who had been mopping the same tile for the past 5 minutes, stood still. His eyes settled on me. Something was wrong, and I had made a mistake. I had noticed. The realization hit me so hard I nearly choked on it. My stomach clenched, my hands gripping the chair beneath me so tightly my knuckles turned white. I wasn't supposed to notice that Miss Lyle had never blinked. I wasn't supposed to ask where Mrs. Collins was. I wasn't supposed to tell them. But I had. And now they were all staring. The principal smiled, but it was too polite, too controlled. "You seem a little disoriented," she said gently. "Maybe you should go lie down in the nurse's office for a while." Number. Every muscle in my body screamed to run, but I didn't, not yet. Because if I ran now, I wouldn't make it. I had to be careful. I forced myself to swallow the panic rising in my throat, forced myself to nod. Yeah, maybe I just need some air." Her smile didn't waver. She stood slowly, like she had all the time in the world. "I'll walk you there," she said. The janitor had stopped mopping completely. He was just standing there, staring at the floor like he was listening. I couldn't stay here. I had to get back to my classroom. The second the principal stepped toward me, I moved. Fast. I pushed back from the chair and bolted into the hallway before she could grab my arm. I heard her voice sharp, calling after me, but I didn't look back. I couldn't look back. The hallway stretched too long in front of me. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, buzzing softly. I felt like I was running in slow motion, like the air had thickened around me, trying to hold me in place. I turned the corner, my shoes skidding against the linoleum. My classroom door was open. I burst inside, breathless, expecting chaos, expecting the students to be gone, to see nothing but empty desks and silence. But no. They were still there, sitting at their desks just as I had left them. Except now, they weren't moving. Every single one of them sat perfectly still, not writing, not whispering, just waiting. My breath hitched. Then Mia turned her head toward me. Slow, too slow, like a puppet on invisible strings. My stomach dropped. Her lips parted, but her voice was flat, wrong. "The principal is looking for you." I took a step back. Lucas turned his head next, the exact same way. "You should go to the nurse's office," he said. My heartbeat hammered against my ribs. This wasn't real. This wasn't real. I scanned the room, chest tightening. They weren't blinking. Not a single one of them. Then I saw the desk. Mrs. Collins' desk. For the first time, I noticed something was different. Her chair was pushed back, like someone had been there. But no one was. Or had been. A sickening realization churned in my stomach. Mrs. Collins hadn't called out. She had never left. And now I had no idea where she was. A sound echoed behind me, a soft click. The classroom door had shut. I spun around, and my chest nearly caved in on itself. Miss Lyle stood in front of it, blocking the exit. She hadn't been there a second ago, but now she was. Standing perfectly still, her arms at her sides, those lifeless gray eyes boring into me. The air in the room changed. Not colder, not warmer. Just different. Like the space itself had warped, like it was no longer part of the school, no longer part of anything. My skin crawled. I took a slow step backward. "Where is Mrs. Collins?" Miss Lyle tilted her head. That same unnatural tilt. The classroom groaned, not loudly, not like the building was shifting, but like the very air inside it had stretched. She took a step toward me. Not walking. Gliding. Like her feet weren't touching the floor at all. I felt something in me snap. I ran. I dove past the desks, knocking over chairs, my pulse a roaring sound in my ears. I reached for the window, slammed it open. The world outside wasn't there. Just blackness. No playground, no parking lot, no sky. Nothing. I stumbled back, my breath ragged. The classroom wasn't real anymore. A whisper curled around my mind, soft as silk. "You were never supposed to notice." I turned toward her, toward it. Miss Lyle's face rippled. For a brief moment, I saw something else beneath it. Something empty. Something that shouldn't exist. A shape without a shape. A presence that had been here long before me and would be here long after. And then, the door burst open. The spell shattered. Reality slammed back into place so fast it hurt. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The classroom window showed the real world outside the playground, the sky, the teachers walking by. I gasped, my knees weak, collapsing to the floor. Mrs. Collins stood in the doorway. Real, tangible, alive. She frowned, stepping inside. What on earth? I turned back to the classroom, my head still spinning. The desks, the kids, all of them were normal. Lucas blinked at me, confused. Mia whispered something to the girl beside her. The chairs I had knocked over were upright again, like nothing had happened. Miss Lyle was gone. Vanished. Like she had never been there. Mrs. Collins knelt beside me, concern in her eyes. Are you all right? I couldn't speak, couldn't move, because I knew they wouldn't remember. Not the students, not the teachers. No one. It had erased itself. I sat there, gasping, my whole body trembling. Mrs. Collins helped me up, but I barely felt it. I turned toward the chalkboard. It was clean. No sign of anything, except at the very bottom, written in the faintest chalk. A message. Just for me. I will return when you forget. I never spoke about it. Not to my parents, not to my friends, not even to Lucas or Mia. Because I knew the truth. It was still there, waiting. For another student. For another day. For when someone else noticed. Because that's how it works. It waits. Until someone sees what they shouldn't. And then it plays the game all over again. We left the city just after dawn, the highway stretching endlessly ahead, the weight of civilization peeling away with every mile. The plan was simple, a 5-day camping trip deep in Black Hollow Forest, far from the beaten trails, no phone service, no tourists, just us and the wild. We had done trips like this before, short ones, a night or two at a lake, maybe a weekend hike. But this was different, deeper, remote, the kind of place where even park rangers don't patrol often. Last stop for gas, Darren said as we pulled into the final outpost town before the forest, the last slice of civilization. A run-down general store, a single gas pump, a diner with flickering neon lights. You sure this is the best route? Nate asked, studying the map on his lap. Of course, Darren replied, ever confident. He was the one who had picked the spot, a clearing a few miles off trail, hidden away from weekend campers. No one's been there in years, totally untouched. Yeah, there's usually a reason for that, Will muttered. I grabbed snacks while Darren filled the tank, exchanging brief pleasantries with the old man behind the counter. His sunken eyes flicked toward my hiking boots. You boys heading into the forest? Yep, I said, 5 days out at Black Hollow. A pause, then slowly, stay close to your sight. I half laughed. That's the plan. The old man didn't smile back. You go off too far, you won't find your way back. Something about the way he said it made my stomach turn. Nate was honking the horn before I could respond. I shoved the snacks in my pack and hurried back to the car. As we pulled onto the dirt road leading to the forest, I looked back. The old man was still watching. By midday, we were deep into the hollow. The trees grew taller here, denser, the kind that blocked out half the sky, even in broad daylight. It was beautiful, in a lonely kind of way. The clearing was just as Darren had described it, wide-open patch of earth, soft pine needles underfoot, a perfect space for our tents. We unpacked quickly. The fire pit was built, the tents went up, and soon, the air was thick with the smell of burning wood and sizzling meat. To survival, Darren grinned, raising a beer. We drank, we laughed, we let the forest settle around us. The first few hours, everything felt normal, good even. The stillness of the forest, the crackle of the fire, the occasional rustle of an animal in the brush. But as night fell, something shifted. The quiet became too quiet. Even the wind had stopped. I tried to ignore it. Tried to focus on the fire, the warmth of beer in my stomach, the sound of Nate telling some half-remembered college story. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was listening. The fire burned low. Will was already snoring inside his tent. Darren tossed the last beer can into the trash bag and stretched. "I'm hitting the sack," he said. Nate groaned, rubbing his face. "Yeah, me too." I hesitated. "I'll stay up a bit." Darren shrugged. "Your funeral. The forest gets weird at night." I watched them disappear into their tents, the campsite suddenly smaller, without their voices filling it. I threw another log on the fire, watched the embers flick and twist in the air. The night pressed in around me. Thick, heavy. Then, a snap, somewhere just beyond the tree line. My back stiffened. A twig, breaking under something's weight. Could have been an animal, a deer, a raccoon. But it hadn't sounded casual. It had sounded careful. I turned, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Nothing but trees. Then, crunch. The sound of steps. Slow, deliberate. Circling the camp. The fire crackled behind me, casting long, flickering shadows. My breath came shallow. I grabbed my flashlight and swung it toward the trees. The beam sliced through the dark and caught nothing. Just tangled branches, empty forest. I exhaled, forcing myself to relax. I was being stupid. It was probably an animal passing through. Nothing more. Still, I gave the trees one last glance before stepping toward my tent. And that's when I noticed. Will's tent was unzipped, just a few inches, like someone had pulled it open from the outside. My breath stalled. "Will?" I whispered. No response. I stepped closer. "Will, wake up." Still nothing. I crouched, reaching for the tent flap. Will stirred suddenly, his arm flailing as he let out a groggy noise. I yelped, stumbling back. He blinked blearily at me. The hell, man? I swallowed hard. "Did you unzip your tent?" He frowned. "Number." I pointed. "It's open." Will leaned up, looking at the unzipped flap. His expression shifted. His mouth snapped shut. The noise came again. Crunch. Steps. Will's eyes flicked toward the trees. Slowly, he reached for his flashlight. We both turned, breath held, and shined the light into the woods. The trees stood still. The night stretched empty. Nothing there. No movement. No wind. Nothing. Will let out a nervous chuckle. "Jesus, man, you freaked me out." I forced a laugh, but it came out wrong. Something still felt off. Will zipped up his tent fully this time. "Get some sleep." I nodded, but as I climbed into my own tent, zipped it shut tight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there. Watching. Waiting. Just beyond the trees. Listening. I didn't sleep. Not really. I lay there for hours, my back pressed against the thin fabric of the tent, my ears straining for any sound beyond the steady rhythm of Will's snoring. The forest was too silent. It wasn't natural. I grew up camping. I knew the sounds that should have been there: owls, crickets, the occasional distant rustle of an animal moving through the brush, the kind of white noise that made the woods feel alive. But there was nothing. Just the slow, steady thudding of my heartbeat in my ears. I closed my eyes. Tried to convince myself I was imagining it. Tried to convince myself that I wasn't waiting for the noise to come back. I don't know when I drifted off, but when I woke up, something was wrong. At first, I couldn't tell what. The tent was still zipped, my sleeping bag still wrapped tightly around me. Then I realized the fire was out. The glow of embers, the last crackling remnants that should have lasted until dawn, completely gone. Someone had put it out. I sat up, my breath hitched. The air inside the tent felt thick, heavy. Something had changed. Then, rustling. Soft, slow. From just outside my tent, I went completely still. It was close. Closer than before. No more crunching footsteps in the distance. No more snapping twigs at the tree line. Right outside. I held my breath. Listened. The sound was wrong. Not footsteps, not an animal. Like fingertips brushing against fabric. Against my tent. A slow, dragging touch across the nylon. My blood went cold. I wanted to move. I wanted to scream. But I just sat there, paralyzed. The hand or whatever it waist-railed along the side of the tent. Then stopped. The silence that followed was worse. I counted the second in my head. 5, 10, 15. Nothing. Just the sound of my own heartbeat hammering against my ribs. Then, all at once, a zipper. Not mine. One of the others. A slow, deliberate unzip. I forced myself to move. I scrambled for my flashlight, my hands fumbling in the dark. I clicked it on. The inside of my tent flooded with pale, shaky light. I held my breath. Listened. The zipper had stopped. Silence. I forced myself to act. I unzipped my own tent fast. 2 fast stands swung the flashlight beam into the campsite. The others' tents were all closed. No movement. No one standing there. The fire pit sat cold and dead, ashes scattered across the ground. I swung the beam toward the trees. Nothing. Just the endless, empty forest. The wind picked up suddenly, rattling the branches. A sharp, dry whisper. I swallowed hard. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had just been dreaming. But I didn't believe that. Not really. I stayed awake for the rest of the night. By morning, I had almost convinced myself that I had imagined the whole thing. Almost. Nate was the first one up. I heard him grumbling as he unzipped his tent, stepping into the early morning chill. Jesus, he muttered, rubbing his arms. Why is it so cold? Darren sat up in his tent, groaning. Fire went out early. Yeah, no shit. Did someone throw water on it? The way he said it made my stomach tighten. I stepped out, shivering in the morning air. The ashes from last night's fire were soaked, like someone had doused them with water. Not something the wind would have done. Not something we did. Darren frowned, crouching near the pit. That's weird. Maybe it rained, Will suggested, stepping out of his tent and stretching. It didn't, I said quickly. They all looked at me. I hesitated. I thought I heard something last night, I admitted. Like someone moving around. I think someone was in the camp. A beat of silence. Then Darren scoffed. Like what? A hiker? I shook my head. I didn't know what to say. Will ran a hand through his hair. You seriously think someone came here and put out our fire in the middle of the night? I exhaled. I don't know. I just know what I heard. No one spoke after that. The conversation died. I could tell they didn't want to believe me. Didn't want to believe that maybe we weren't alone out here. Darren clapped his hands together. All right, enough of the creepy campfire stories. Let's get breakfast going. The others followed his lead. But I couldn't shake the feeling. The unease sat in my stomach. Like something was watching. Like something was waiting. The second night was worse. I had spent the day trying to push the fear away. We hiked. We fished at the nearby creek. We played cards in the afternoon sun. By the time the fire was roaring again, I had almost convinced myself it was fine. That last night had been nothing. That I was just on edge. But then night fell, and the footsteps came back. It started the same way. A faint snap somewhere in the trees. Then closer. Circling. By the time I heard the first crunch of dirt right outside the tents, I knew. We were not alone. I sat up, pulse pounding. And then, a whisper. Low, faint. From somewhere outside. I went rigid. The words were too soft to make out. But it was a voice. A human voice. And I was sure of one thing. It wasn't any of us. I reached for my phone, my fingers shaking. The screen glowed faintly. No service, no signal. I turned my head slightly, listening. The voice had stopped. The steps had stopped. A terrible silence stretched over the camp. Then, suddenly, the sound of a zipper. Slow. From one of the tents. I held my breath. The others were asleep. So who was opening their tent? I gripped my flashlight. Turned it on. The beam cut through the dark. I swung it toward the sound. And froze. Will's tent. The zipper was half open, but he was still inside. Still asleep. Something had unzipped it from the outside. My heart stalled. Then, the trees rustled. A shadow moved just beyond the firelight. Gone before I could see it clearly. I turned to the others, my voice barely above a whisper. Wake up. They didn't stir. I turned back to the trees, staring into the black, into whatever was staring back. I sat frozen, the beam of my flashlight shaking slightly in my grip. The trees just beyond the firelight stood motionless, the darkness between them thick, unyielding. I knew I had seen something move, a shape, a figure, something, but now there was nothing. I turned back to Will's tent. The zipper was still half open. Will was still inside, still asleep. Something had unzipped it from the outside. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering. Wake up, I hissed. No response. The others were dead asleep, their slow, even breathing the only sound besides the faint crackle of the dying fire. I reached over and shook Will's tent. Will, wake up. He groaned, shifting inside his sleeping bag. Ning what? His voice was thick with sleep. I pointed at the tent flap. Did you unzip this? He blinked at me, unfocused. What? "Did you unzip your tent?" I repeated, voice sharper this time. Will sat up, rubbing his face. He squinted at the half-open flap. "Number. Why the hell would I?" His expression changed. The grogginess vanished. He fully sat up now, staring at the open zipper, realization settling over him like a weight. "What the fuck?" he whispered. A noise cut through the quiet. Not footsteps. Not whispers. A low, wheezing breath. Right behind us. Will and I both turned fast. I swung my flashlight back toward the trees. The light caught something. A figure, thin, pale, hunched, standing just beyond the reach of our camp. It was only there for a second. The moment the light hit it, it moved. Fast, too fast. Gone in an instant. Will let out a strangled noise. "Holy shit, you see that?" I couldn't speak. Couldn't move. Because now I understood. Whatever's out here with us wasn't just watching anymore. It had been inside the camp. And it wasn't afraid of being seen. I woke the others up. Nate grumbled, pissed off at first, but the moment he saw our faces, he sobered. Darren rubbed his eyes, frowning. "What's going on?" Will gestured wildly at the trees. Someone was just out there. Darren squinted at the darkness. "A hiker." Will shook his head. No, man. It wasn't normal. He was I don't know. He moved so fast." I swallowed hard, and someone unzipped Will's tent. That got their attention. Nate sat up straighter. "What?" I nodded. I heard something, and when I looked, his tent was open. Silence. Then Darren exhaled sharply. Okay, let's not panic." Will scoffed. "Not panic? Dude, I saw someone standing right over there." Darren raised a hand. "I'm not saying nothing happened. I'm saying we need to be smart." He looked at me. "You're sure it wasn't just an animal?" I shook my head, too deliberate. Darren let out a slow breath, thinking, "All right, we're packing up first thing in the morning." Nate frowned. "Dude, we're supposed to be out here for another 3 days." "Yeah, well, fuck that," Will muttered. "I'm not sleeping here again." I didn't argue. The night felt different now. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was unnatural. Like the forest itself was waiting. Darren clapped his hands together. "All right, nobody sleeps alone tonight. Buddy system. And we keep the fire going until dawn." We nodded. But deep down, I think we all knew. It wouldn't matter. I was paired with Will. We sat outside our tent, staring at the fire, watching the tree line like hawks. Nobody spoke much. Nobody wanted to. Hours passed. At some point, I started to relax just a little. Maybe we had scared it off. Maybe the light, the noise, our presence had been enough. And then, a sound. Distant. Low. A whistle. I stiffened. Will grabbed my arm. "Dude." It came again. A slow, deliberate whistle. Not random. A tune. A melody. But wrong. Off-key, like someone struggling to remember the notes. It echoed through the trees. Floating. Closer. I reached for my flashlight. My hands were shaking. The whistling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Will swallowed. "What the fuck is going on?" I didn't answer. I didn't know. And then Nate screamed. The sound ripped through the campsite. Raw, panicked. We jumped to our feet. Nate, Darren's voice, thick with fear. Another scream. Coming from his tent. We ran. I yanked open his tent flap, flashlight beam flooding the inside. It was empty. Nate was gone. And the zipper was unzipped from the outside. Chaos. Yelling, running, flashlights swinging wildly through the trees. No sign of Nate. No sound of movement. It was like he had been plucked out of existence. Darren was losing it. We need to look for him, now. Will shook his head. What if that's what they want? Darren turned on him. Who's they? You think there's some fucking thing out here hunting us? Will didn't answer. None of us did. Because the truth was, we didn't know. And that was worse. So much worse. Darren pulled out his phone. I'm calling for help. There's no service, I reminded him. He ignored me, dialing anyway. Holding the screen up, waiting. His face dropped. Then, slowly, he turned the phone around. Showed us the screen. A text message from an unknown number. One word. Run. The flashlight flickered. The fire snapped. And just beyond the tree line, the whistling started again. Closer now. So much closer. We ran. We ran blindly into the forest, the cold night air burning in my lungs. The beam of my flashlight bounced wildly over the trees, barely cutting through the darkness. Darren was ahead of me, Will just behind, his breath ragged, his footsteps frantic. Nate was gone, vanished. And something was out here with us. The whistling followed. Low, off-key, threading through the trees like a voice just beyond a wall, always too far to pinpoint but never far enough to ignore. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. Where the fuck are we going? Will panted. Back to the car, Darren barked. His voice was raw, almost shaking. He was scared. We all were. I tried to think. The car was miles away, parked at the base of the trail. The path was barely marked, and in our panic, we had bolted in a random direction. We're off trail, I gasped. We need to. A sound cut through the trees. A scream. Short, guttural. Nate. I skidded to a stop. Will grabbed my arm. No, don't. I stared into the dark, my stomach twisting. My body screamed, go back. Help him. But deep down I knew. That wasn't a scream for help. It was a scream of something ending. Darren turned back, eyes wide. We have to. The whistling stopped. And that was worse. So much worse. Because it meant whoever was making it was done playing. We didn't speak. We just moved. Faster, harder, barely avoiding tree roots and low branches. My legs burned, my chest ached, but I didn't stop. Not until we saw the clearing. Not until we saw the tents. We had been running for 10 minutes. We had been sprinting in a straight fucking line. And yet, somehow, we were right back where we started. Will doubled over, hands on his knees, gasping. What the fuck? He panted. What the actual fuck? Darren turned in circles, shaking his head. That's not possible. I swallowed hard. I knew what the unspoken question was. Had we been running in a circle? Had we done this to ourselves? Or had something else led us back? Will's voice was hoarse. We have to get the fuck out of here. Darren squared his shoulders, trying to steady himself. Okay, we regroup. We take the trail back. We don't run. We don't panic. We just. Then we saw it. Nate's tent. It was still zipped up, still untouched, like he had never left, like he had never been taken. Something cold crept into my stomach. Will's flashlight shook in his hand. We're not going in there, right? Darren didn't answer. None of us did, because we already knew the answer. We had to. Darren moved first, his jaw clenched, his breath shallow. He unzipped the tent in one fast motion, stepping back like he expected something to lunge out. Nothing did. But what was inside was worse. Nate's backpack, his sleeping bag neatly laid out. His phone resting on top. Will reached for it, but I grabbed his wrist. Wait. Something felt wrong. Like the moment we touched it, something would change. I exhaled sharply. Turn on your camera first. Will swallowed, nodded. He pulled out his phone, started recording, and with his free hand, reached for Nate's. The screen was still on. A video. A recording from last night. He hit play. The footage was dark, grainy. Nate's voice muttered something about the cold, complaining about the trip. His hand moved, adjusting the phone's angle. The camera must have been propped against something, left recording as he got into his sleeping bag. Then, a sound. The same whistle. Soft, distant. Nate mumbled something, half asleep. Didn't hear it. But the camera kept rolling. The whistle grew louder. A shape appeared on the screen. A figure just outside his tent. Thin, wrong. Standing perfectly still. Then, a hand. Reaching for the zipper. Slow. Deliberate. The zipper pulled down an inch. Then another. Then another. The shape moved inside. Then, the camera went black. And that was it. The end of the recording. Will let out a choked noise and dropped the phone. I stepped back. My entire body was buzzing with something primal, something raw. Darren's breath hitched. This isn't real, he whispered. The words felt weak. And then, we heard it. A zipper. Not Nate's tent. One of ours. Slow. Dragging. We turned, and I swear to God, for just a second, I saw something slip inside Darren's tent. A shadow. A shape. The tent bulged slightly before going still. Will dropped his flashlight. Nope-a-nope. Darren didn't move. He was shaking. And then, the tent zipper started pulling back up. Closing. Like whatever had entered was settling in. Like it had been there all along. I snapped. I grabbed Darren's arm. We are leaving. We ran. Didn't pack, didn't look back. Just grabbed the car keys and sprinted for the trail. The wind howled through the trees, the shadows pressing in. The whistling returned. Not behind us. Not ahead. All around. Like the whole forest was humming with it. Then, we hit the car. And I swear, just before I yanked the door open, I felt something behind me. So close, it could have breathed on my neck. I jumped inside, slammed the door shut. Darren hit the ignition. The car rumbled to life. Will was already screaming, "Go, go, go." We tore down the dirt road, the headlights carving through the blackness. The campsite disappeared behind us. The forest swallowed itself whole. And as we hit the highway, as the trees finally fell away, as civilization welcomed us back with open arms, I realized something that made my stomach drop. Nate's phone. We had left it behind. And on that phone, on that fucking video, was proof. Proof that we hadn't imagined it. Proof that someone or something had been with us in the woods. And now they knew our faces. Now they knew our names. Now they knew exactly where to find us. None of us spoke on the drive back. The car tore down the road at full speed, the dirt path turning into pavement, then pavement into the empty highway. The radio stayed off, the only sound the engine groaning beneath Darren's grip on the wheel. I kept my eyes locked on the rear-view mirror. I don't know what I expected to see. A shadow standing at the edge of the tree line, a figure chasing after us on all fours. I couldn't shake the feeling that we had barely escaped, that we weren't supposed to. Darren kept one hand clenched tight around the wheel, the other gripping his knee. His knuckles were white. What the fuck was that? No one answered. Will was in the back seat, hunched over, staring at the floor like if he looked up, the world would swallow him whole. "We should call the police," I said, my voice rough. Darren let out a sharp laugh, one that had no humor in it. "And say what? That our friend disappeared, and we left his ass in the woods." Will exhaled slowly. "Nate's dead." The words stuck. No one disagreed. It felt wrong to say it, but we all knew. Knew the second we heard that scream. Knew the second we saw that thing outside his tent. Nate wasn't coming back. I leaned forward, rubbing my hands over my face. My skin was cold, my fingers numb. "We need to go back for his phone," I said finally. Darren's hands tightened on the wheel. "Are you fucking insane?" "That video," I swallowed. "It's proof. It shows something was there." Will shook his head. "I'm never going back in those woods." Darren glanced at me in the mirror. "You really want to go back and play hero? Walk back into that fucking place and look for a phone?" I didn't answer. Because no, I didn't. But I also knew that whoever whatever was out there had let us go. For now. And if we just forgot, if we just moved on like it had never happened, I wasn't sure it would let us stay forgotten. Darren let out a sharp breath. "We're going home." And that was the end of it. The next day, I checked the news. Nothing. No reports of a missing hiker. No stories of strange occurrences in Black Hollow Forest. I waited for days. A week. Still nothing. The world moved on like Nate had never existed. Darren tried to drink it away. Will threw himself into work. We never spoke about it, not really. It became this ugly, heavy thing hanging over all of us, something that lived in the space between our words. And for a while, I convinced myself that we were okay, that it was over. Until I woke up to a text message. It came at 2:47 a.m. I had been sleeping light, restless, my dreams thick with trees and whistling, and the feeling of something brushing against my tent. My phone buzzed from the nightstand. I blinked awake, groggy. Reached for it. One new message. From an unknown number. Just 3 words. "I found you." My blood turned to ice. I sat up fast, my pulse hammering. The air in my apartment felt wrong. Too quiet. Too still. I turned on the bedside lamp, my hands shaking. I checked the message again. My breath came in short, uneven bursts. The number was blocked. I tried calling back. Nothing. Then another text. A photo. My stomach dropped. I clicked it open with stiff fingers. The image loaded slowly. It was grainy, dark, but I knew what I was looking at. My apartment building. The photo had been taken from outside, from the street, from directly below my window. I dropped the phone like it had burned me. My ears buzzed, my hands clenched into fists, my breath coming too fast, too shallow. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Another buzz. One more message. It's okay, I'm already inside. I jumped out of bed, heart slamming, panic taking over. I grabbed my phone, my vision blurring as I scrolled to Will's number. He picked up on the first ring. "Dude," he breathed, "you got the text too." My stomach flipped. "You got one?" Just now, his voice was thin, shaking. The same picture, same words. Darren's voice broke in from the background. He was on speaker. Me too. The weight of it hit me all at once. This wasn't random. It wasn't just me. We had brought something back. I grabbed a jacket, shoved my feet into my shoes. We need to get out of our apartments, right now. Darren swore under his breath. Where the fuck do we even go? I thought about it. For the first time since we left those woods, I thought. And then it hit me. The general store. A pause. "The one we stopped at before the trip?" Will asked. I nodded, even though they couldn't see me. "The guy, the old man, he knew something." Darren hesitated. "You really think that's going to help?" I clenched my jaw. "I don't know," I swallowed, "but I don't think we have a choice." We drove through the night. None of us spoke much. There was nothing left to say. By the time we pulled into the gas station, the sky was just beginning to turn gray. The same neon diner sign flickered in the window, casting sharp red light onto the pavement. The old man was sitting behind the counter, just like before. His eyes landed on us the moment we walked in. He didn't look surprised, didn't look confused, just tired, like he had seen this before, like he already knew. Darren was the first to speak. "We need your help." The old man sighed. Then, slowly, he stood. "I told you, boys," he muttered. His voice was hoarse, heavy. "You should have stayed close to your site. We never should have gone into that forest. We never should have stayed after the first night. And we never should have run. Because now it knows us. Now it follows. And we have no idea how to make it stop." I'm not the kind of person who believes in ghosts. Or at least, I wasn't. My name is Owen Carter. I've spent most of my life building a respectable career in architecture, working with high-end developers to reshape skylines and leave my mark on the world. I've always considered myself practical, logical, a man who deals with blueprints and concrete, not myths and legends. But some things defy logic. Some things refuse to stay buried. I never told anyone about what happened when I was a kid. Not my wife, not my co-workers, not even my closest friends. I've spent decades pretending it never happened, convincing myself that I was just young, impressionable, making things up. And yet, I still wake up some nights, drenched in sweat, feeling something breathing at the foot of my bed. I can still hear it whispering. This is the story of how I lost my brother. I grew up in a small town in northern Maine, the kind of place where the trees stretch for miles. The winters are unforgiving, and kids have to invent their own fun. There weren't shopping malls or big amusement parks, just dense forests and old abandoned houses that held the kind of mysteries children couldn't resist. It was the early 90s, before smartphones and constant supervision. My older brother, Caleb, was 12, and I was 10. Our younger sister, Emily, was 8. We were close, the kind of siblings who got into trouble together, dared each other to do stupid things, and spent our summers exploring every inch of our neighborhood. One summer, Caleb heard about a game from one of the older kids at school, something called the penny game. It's like a magic 8-ball, he explained, pulling a wrinkled piece of notebook paper from his backpack. You ask a question, and the spirits answer. Emily wrinkled her nose. That's stupid. Caleb ignored her. He grabbed a penny from the counter, smoothing out the paper on the kitchen table. He had written the alphabet across the top, along with yes and no at the corners. All we do, he said, placing the penny in the middle, is rest our fingers on it and ask a question. I hesitated. I wasn't sure why, but something about it made me uneasy. Maybe it was the way Caleb looked so determined, his fingers gripping the edge of the table like he was waiting for something to happen. It's just a game, he said. So we played. The first few times nothing happened. We asked stupid questions. Will we be rich? Does Emily have a secret boyfriend? And when the penny finally moved, it was barely more than a slow crawl across the page. Yes, it spelled. We laughed. We kept playing. It became a thing we did on rainy afternoons, huddled in Caleb's room with nothing better to do. Then, one day, everything changed. It was late, the sky outside a heavy gray, rain hammering against the windows. Our parents had gone out to dinner, leaving us alone for the evening. Emily was watching cartoons in the living room, uninterested in our little ritual. Caleb and I sat at the table, the paper spread between us. Caleb grinned. Want to ask it something creepy? I swallowed. Like what? He thought for a second. Then, pressing his fingers lightly on the penny, he whispered, "Who are you?" The penny didn't move at first. Then, slowly, painfully, it dragged across the page. H. U. N. G. R. Yai. A chill ran down my spine. Caleb frowned. Hungry for what? The penny twitched. Then, with unnatural speed, it shot across the page. M. E. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, from somewhere behind us, deep in the shadows of the kitchen, came a noise. A low, guttural growl. We did not own a dog. My entire body locked up. Caleb went pale. I saw his hands trembling as he reached for the paper, crumpling it in his fists. Nope, we're done. His voice was forced, strained. It's just a stupid game. He grabbed the paper and tossed it in the sink, fumbling for the matches our dad kept in the cabinet. With shaking hands, he lit the edges, watching the flames curl around the paper. When it was nothing but blackened scraps, he turned on the faucet and let the water wash it away. The room felt lighter. I exhaled, trying to laugh it off. Well, that was weird. Caleb forced a grin. Guess we won't be playing that again. And we didn't. At least not for a while. A few weeks later, everything changed. Our dad got a promotion, and we packed up our lives to move to a new town in Massachusetts. It was bigger, busier, and full of new opportunities. Emily was thrilled. Caleb was indifferent. But I noticed something was different about him. He stopped sleeping. At night, I would hear him shifting in his bed, tossing, turning, whispering under his breath. Sometimes, when I woke up to go to the bathroom, I'd see him sitting up, staring at the door, his hands gripping his blanket so tight his knuckles were white. "What's wrong with you?" I asked one morning. He looked at me, and I finally saw it. The dark circles under his eyes, the sunken look in his face, the sheer exhaustion. "It comes to my room," he whispered. I frowned. "What does?" Caleb swallowed. "The thing we talked to." I felt my stomach drop. "You're just having nightmares," I said, trying to sound rational. Caleb shook his head. "Number, I can hear it breathing, Owen. It stands by my bed. I feel the mattress dip when it leans in. It keeps saying the same thing over and over." I hesitated. "What does it say?" His voice was barely above a breath. "Feed me." I felt cold all over. For the first time, I looked at my brother and saw real fear. I wanted to tell him it was all in his head, that it was just his imagination, but something about the way he said it, the way his voice trembled, it made my skin crawl. "What do you want to do?" I finally asked. Caleb took a slow breath. "We need to talk to it." I felt my pulse quicken. "Are you insane?" "Number, this time we do it right. We get rid of it for good." I didn't argue, because deep down, I was terrified he was right. That was on a Monday. By Friday night, our parents were out for the evening. Emily was watching television upstairs. Caleb and I sat at the dining table. The Ouija board lay before us. I struck a match to light the candles. The flame went out instantly. I struck another. Gone. The third time, it stayed lit. We placed our fingers on the planchette. Caleb took a breath, and we began. The candle flames flickered, casting long shadows against the walls. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the trees and making the old house creak as if it were alive. The Ouija board sat between us, the letters stark against the wooden surface. Caleb placed his fingers on the planchette first, nodding for me to do the same. I hesitated. Everything in me screamed that this was a mistake, but I pressed my fingers against the smooth plastic anyway. "Okay," Caleb whispered. "We do this carefully. We follow the rules." I swallowed hard. "And if it answers?" "Then we tell it to go away." It sounded simple enough, but something inside me knew that once we started, there would be no turning back. Caleb took a breath and spoke. "Is there a spirit here with us?" For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the planchette twitched. A slow, dragging movement so faint I almost convinced myself it was just our hands shaking. But then it moved again, deliberate and steady. Yai. E-S. A chill ran down my spine. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Who are you?" The planchette jerked sharply, faster this time. H-U-N-G-R. Yai. My fingers trembled. Caleb swallowed hard. What do you want? The answer came before he finished the question. F. O. O. D. Caleb shot me a glance. I could see the struggle on his face, his logical mind wrestling with the undeniable truth of what was happening. I wanted to throw the board across the room to break the planchette in half to stop whatever this was before it got worse. Instead, Caleb asked, "What kind of food?" The planchette hesitated. Then it spelled M. E. T. The word sent a sickening wave through my stomach. I could feel something watching us. Not in the casual way you feel eyes on you in a crowded room, but something deeper, more primal, like a presence pressing in from the edges of the room, unseen but undeniably there. I tried to steady my breath. "Caleb, I don't think we should." A sound cut me off. A low, wet, slurping noise like something licking its lips. I froze. It was coming from the corner of the room, the one cloaked in darkness, just beyond the reach of the candlelight. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Caleb inhaled sharply. "We have to end this, now." He moved the planchette to goodbye. But before we could lift our hands, it yanked itself away. No. The candles flickered violently. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with something oppressive and suffocating. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then slowly, agonizingly, the planchette began moving again. N. O. T. F. I. N. I. S. H. E. D. My breath hitched. Caleb's face was pale. "Too bad," he muttered. "We're finishing this." He shoved the planchette back to goodbye with such force that I expected it to splinter. The moment it touched the word, the wind outside slammed against the house with a deafening roar. The front door burst open. Every candle blew out at once, and the house was swallowed in darkness. For a moment, neither of us moved. The only sound was our breathing, ragged and shallow. Then a soft noise broke the silence. A drip, drip, drip. It was coming from the kitchen. Caleb grabbed my arm. "Come on." I didn't want to move. Every instinct told me to stay right where I was. But Caleb was already standing, dragging me with him. The house was pitch black. The only light came from the moon filtering weakly through the windows. It cast everything in cold, silvery shadows, making the furniture look twisted and unfamiliar. We stepped into the kitchen and stopped. The sink was running. Not full blast, just a thin stream of water trickling down the drain. But that wasn't the part that made my stomach drop. The counter was covered in raw meat. Packages of ground beef, steak, chicken all torn open. The contents spilled across the surface like something had been searching for the perfect cut. Some pieces were missing chunks, ragged bites taken out of them. And in the center of the mess was the penny. The same one we had used for the penny game. It was standing on its edge, perfectly balanced. Caleb exhaled shakily. "I didn't do this." "I know." We stared at the scene for another moment before Caleb finally reached out and turned off the faucet. The sound of the water stopped, leaving only the deafening silence of the house. I swallowed hard. What do we do now? Caleb licked his lips. We follow the rules, we destroy the board. He grabbed it from the table and stormed toward the back door. I followed, heart pounding. The wind outside howled, bending the trees, shaking the house like it was trying to get in. Caleb grabbed the lighter from the shelf near the door and stepped onto the porch. I hesitated before joining him. We didn't say anything. We didn't need to. Caleb set the board on the ground, flicked the lighter, and held the flame to the wood. Nothing happened. The flame flickered uselessly, licking at the surface but refusing to catch. Caleb frowned and tried again. The same result. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up. Then the back door slammed shut behind us. We both spun around. Through the glass, I saw something inside the house. A shadow, tall, watching, grinning. Then a deep, rasping voice whispered from behind us. More. Caleb grabbed my arm. Run. We didn't stop running until we reached the end of the street. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't dare slow down. We only stopped when we reached the old community church, its heavy wooden doors looming in front of us. Caleb doubled over, catching his breath. What the hell was that? I shook my head, still trying to process what I had seen, what I had felt. We need to go back, I said finally. Caleb shot me a look. Are you insane? We have to finish this. Caleb hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, he nodded. We walked back. The house was silent when we returned. The back door was wide open. The Ouija board was gone. And something had scrawled words across the kitchen wall in what looked like raw meat. You didn't feed me. My stomach turned. Caleb grabbed my wrist. His fingers dug into my skin. We are not staying here. For the first time, I agreed with him. We ran upstairs, waking Emily, grabbing our things, and getting the hell out. We never slept in that house again. But whatever we had let in, it wasn't done with us. We didn't sleep that night. Caleb, Emily, and I huddled in a cheap motel room across town, our belongings shoved hastily into backpacks. Our parents were still at their dinner, completely unaware that we had fled. Neither of us spoke about what had happened at the house. We just sat there, wide-eyed and silent, as if putting it into words would make it worse. But I already knew it was worse. I kept expecting something to follow us, something lurking in the corners of the room, something watching through the thin motel curtains. The presence I had felt in the house hadn't left my bones. It was still there, gnawing at my nerves, whispering in the back of my mind. More. 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 Caleb sat stiffly on the edge of the bed, staring at his hands. His fingers trembled slightly, barely noticeable, but I saw it. We have to end this, I said finally. Caleb exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. And how do you suggest we do that, Owen? We tried to burn it, and it wouldn't even catch fire. We didn't close the game, I said. We didn't follow the rules. Caleb glanced up at me. He knew I was right. Emily shifted uncomfortably. I don't want to go back there. Neither did I. But I knew we didn't have a choice. We waited until sunrise. Our parents still weren't home when we returned, but I wasn't surprised. They were probably still at the dinner party, drinking and laughing, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding in their own home. The house was silent when we stepped inside, the kind of silence that presses against your ears, making everything feel unreal. The air smelled stale, metallic, like raw meat left in the heat for too long. The words were still there, smeared across the kitchen wall. You didn't feed me. My stomach churned. Caleb clenched his jaw. Let's find the board and finish this. We searched the entire house. The dining table was empty. The living room was untouched. The back porch was barren. Nothing left but the scorch marks from where we had tried to burn it. It was gone. Caleb swore under his breath, "Where the hell is it?" I turned slowly, my skin prickling. The basement. I didn't want to say it. I didn't want to be right. But when I looked at Caleb, he already knew. Neither of us had ever liked the basement. It was unfinished, cluttered with old furniture and forgotten junk. The light bulb on the ceiling flickered when you pulled the chain, and the air always smelled damp like mildew and earth. We stood at the top of the stairs, staring down into the darkness. Emily shivered. "I'm not going down there." Caleb sighed. "Fine. Stay up here." I followed him down. The wooden steps groaned beneath our feet, the dust in the air thick and heavy. The basement wasn't big, just a narrow space with concrete walls, shelves lined with rusted tools, and piles of old furniture covered in moth-eaten sheets. And there, in the center of the floor, was the Ouija board. It sat perfectly still, untouched, as if it had been waiting for us. Caleb swallowed. "Let's get this over with." We knelt down, placing our fingers lightly on the planchette. For a second, nothing happened. Then the board shuddered beneath our hands. The planchette shot across the surface, moving so violently that I nearly pulled away. U-N-G-R. Yeah. I gritted my teeth. "We know." Caleb's voice was steady. "What do you want?" The planchette jerked. M-O-R-E. I felt a cold, sharp presence behind me. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Caleb didn't flinch. "We're ending this." The planchette slammed back to number. The air shifted. The entire basement grew impossibly cold, a dense pressure pushing against my chest like I had been submerged in deep water. Then, from the darkness, something moved. Not a shadow. Not a trick of the light. Something huge. It unfolded itself from the corner, towering over us, watching. Its limbs were long, wrong, shifting unnaturally as it crawled forward, its face shrouded in blackness. The only thing I could see was its mouth wide, grinning, teeth too sharp. Caleb and I both scrambled backward, but it was already there. The planchette moved. F. L. E. S. Huh. The thing laughed. A deep, gurgling sound that rattled in its throat, like something wet and decayed. Caleb grabbed my wrist. "Say goodbye." My voice barely worked. "Goodbye." The planchette didn't move. The air grew tighter, pressing against my lungs. The creature crawled closer, dragging itself forward in jerking motions, its fingers curling like talons. I choked. "Please, goodbye." It screeched. A sound so inhuman, so soul-wrenching that every nerve in my body seized. Caleb ripped the board off the floor, snapping it in half over his knee. Everything stopped. The air cracked like glass fracturing under pressure. The creature reeled back, its form distorting, unraveling, breaking apart in pieces. It shrieked as it collapsed in on itself, folding into the dark like something being pulled away by an unseen force. then, silence. The air in the basement lifted. The pressure was gone. Caleb was shaking. His breathing was ragged, his hands clenched into fists. I stared at the broken board on the ground, my pulse still hammering. We stumbled back upstairs, locking the basement door behind us. Emily stared at us wide-eyed. "Is it over?" I swallowed hard. "I don't know." We never saw the board again. The house felt different afterward, lighter almost. The shadows weren't as deep, the silence not as suffocating. Our parents never questioned why we suddenly refused to sleep in the house. We moved out within the month, relocating to another town. But Caleb changed after that night. He never talked about what happened. He stopped playing video games, stopped laughing the way he used to. Some nights, I'd hear him awake in his room, staring at the ceiling. The nightmares never left him. And sometimes, even now, I see him flinch at the sound of something unseen. Like it's still there. Like it's still waiting. We never talked about that night. Not then, not years later, not even now. There were no explanations that could undo what we saw, no words that could make sense of something beyond the limits of reality. So, we did what we had to, pretended it never happened. We buried it. We moved on. Or at least we tried to. For months after we left that house, things were different. The three of us carried the weight of something unspoken, something lingering just outside the edges of our lives. Emily recovered the quickest. She was young enough to forget, or at least convince herself that it had been nothing but a bad dream. She went back to being her usual self, laughing, playing, slipping into the comfort of childhood, as if the horrors of that house had never touched her. I envied her for that, because for Caleb and me, forgetting wasn't an option. The thing in the basement had left its mark on us. Even after we moved into our new house, I would wake up in the middle of the night with the suffocating feeling that something was watching me. My room would feel too quiet, too still, as if I had been pulled into a space where the world no longer existed. And then there were the dreams. In them, I was always back in that basement. The air heavy, the darkness stretching endlessly. And in the farthest corner, something waiting. It never moved, never spoke, just watched. And though it never reached for me, I always woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, my heart hammering as if I had just barely escaped something I couldn't comprehend. But I got better. Slowly, the fear dulled, the memories faded, the dreams came less often. By the time I left for college, the past was just that, the past. Caleb, though, Caleb never got better. It wasn't just the nightmares with him. It was the way he changed. He used to be the fearless one, the loud one, the brother who was always daring me to push boundaries, to do something crazy, to take risks. But after that night, something in him shut down. He barely spoke, he barely slept, and he never let his room go completely dark. At first, I thought it was just the trauma catching up to him. But then, I started noticing other things. Strange, small things. Meat would go missing from the fridge, not full packages, but little pieces, just enough for someone to take without being noticed. I only realized it was happening when I caught Caleb sneaking raw steak into his room late one night. At first I thought he was just being weird, but then I remembered the words. "You didn't feed me." I wanted to believe it was just paranoia, that maybe he was just acting out, struggling to deal with whatever happened that night. But then I heard the whispers, late at night, coming from his room. They weren't loud, they weren't clear, but they were there. And sometimes, when I walked past his door, I swore I heard something breathing on the other side. When I finally confronted him, he just stared at me. "It's hungry," he said simply. His voice was empty, hollow. That was when I realized I had lost him. Not all at once. Not in a way that anyone else would notice. But piece by piece. And I didn't know how to get him back. The years passed. We grew up, went to college, moved to different cities, built our own lives. I went into architecture. Caleb bounced between jobs, never really settling anywhere. We didn't see each other often. Not because we didn't care, because it was easier not to. Because every time I saw him, I saw that night in his eyes. And every time I saw him, he looked worse. Paler, thinner, as if something was eating him from the inside out. It wasn't until last year that I finally realized the truth. Caleb disappeared 6 months ago. No calls, no messages. No sign of him at his last apartment. Nothing. At first I thought he had just gone off the grid. He had done it before, slipping away for weeks at a time, avoiding people, avoiding life. But this time was different. This time, there was no trace of him at all. And then, last week, a package arrived at my doorstep. No return address, no note. Just a single item inside. A Ouija board. It was old, warped, stained with something dark along the edges. I knew it wasn't the one we had used all those years ago. But the message scrawled across the back in faded, dried ink was enough to make my stomach drop. "Feed me." I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. And for the first time in years, I heard it whisper again. More. That night, I didn't sleep. And for the first time in decades, I knew. It was never about the game. It was about Caleb. It had chosen him. And now that he was gone, it was coming for me. I sit at my dining room table now, staring at the board. I know I shouldn't. I should burn it, bury it, run. But I can't. Because I know, deep down, this isn't over. I can feel it, watching, waiting. And if I don't finish what we started, if I don't end it this time, it won't stop. It will never stop. So, I reach for the planchette. I place my fingers on the board. And I whisper the words I swore I'd never say again. "Kokuri-san, Kokuri-san, are you there?" The candle flickers. The air grows cold. And the planchette moves. Slowly. Deliberately. Yai. E.S. Two months ago, we left behind everything familiar and moved to a house on the edge of nowhere. It was supposed to be a fresh start, more space, fresh air, a slower pace of life. The land stretched far and wide, dense woods pressing in from all sides, and out back, an old barn stood weathered with age. My wife, Meredith, had grand plans for it, dreaming of turning it into a workshop where she could carve her wooden sculptures in peace. We had 3 kids, Noah, our oldest at 10, serious and dependable beyond his years. Ben, 8, still caught in that in-between stage of childhood, brave in the daylight but prone to fears in the dark, and little Rosie, 5, full of wild imagination and endless chatter. The house was big enough for each of them to have their own rooms, but Ben still crept into Noah's bed at night, unwilling to face the dark alone. Noah never complained. He was the kind of brother who understood without needing to be asked. The transition wasn't easy. The kids missed their old friends, their familiar routines. The school was different. The days felt strange. And to make things worse, the job I had lined up fell through at the last minute, throwing our finances into uncertainty. So when Rosie started talking about her new friend, I barely paid attention. Rosie had always had imaginary friends. They came and went, each with their own name, their own little stories. A girl named Lily one week, a boy named Sam the next. They were as temporary as her moods. But this one stayed. His name was Albert, she said. He was old, maybe as old as Dad, maybe older. He lived in her closet. He liked strawberry juice and crackers. Every night, she left him little offerings on plastic plates, carefully arranged before bed. Strangely, she never left a mess. I chalked it up to her usual antics. Every kid had imaginary friends. She was just adjusting to the move, finding comfort in her own way. Then Ben started feeding Albert too. It wasn't much at first, just a few chips, smuggled into the closet like some secret ritual. Doritos, his favorite snack. I noticed the telltale orange stains on his fingertips, the crumbs in his sheets. Ben wasn't the type for imaginary friends. Curious now, I decided to ask about Albert. One afternoon, I stepped into Rosie's room and found both kids kneeling in front of the open closet, whispering. The moment I cleared my throat, they jumped. Rosie clapped a hand over her mouth, and Ben slammed the closet shut with his foot. "Hey, Dad," Ben said too brightly. I walked past them and opened the closet door. Inside, an empty plate with a few crumbs, a cup tipped over, a single drop of red juice staining the carpet. "So Albert likes Doritos now?" I asked, kneeling to their level. Ben nodded, eyes darting to Rosie. "He likes snacks," he muttered. "And what's Albert like?" I pressed, keeping my tone light. Their hesitation lasted only a second before they started spilling details. "He's got blonde hair," Rosie piped up. "He's going bald, like Grandpa Pete," Ben added. "He wears suspenders. He doesn't talk much. He's got a hole in the side of his head. He's here to protect us. And he really, really likes Doritos." A strange silence followed. I forced a smile, though something inside me twisted. "Hold on," I said, raising a hand. "Back up a bit. What do you mean, he's here to protect you?" The moment I asked, their faces changed. Rosie clamped her lips shut, eyes darting to Ben, who looked down at his hands. Then, in a whisper, she said, "He says there's something in the woods, something in the barn, something really, really bad." A loud slam echoed through the room as the bedroom door shut hard. I spun, my pulse hammering. No one was in the hallway, no windows open, no breeze. The silence was suffocating. I had always believed in ghosts. Most people brush these things off, but I'd seen enough strange things in my lifetime to keep an open mind. Meredith, she was the skeptic. When I told her what happened, she laughed and told me I was feeding into Rosie's imagination. But I couldn't shake the feeling. So I started digging. The house had a long history, too long. Families never stayed more than a year. A couple moved out after just 2 weeks, no reason given. Records of past owners were scattered, incomplete. And then I found Albert. Albert Grayson, a father of 3, a widower. The house that stood before ours had burned down, with Albert inside. His children were never found. The story whispered dark things, rumors that Albert had taken their lives before setting the fire, consumed by guilt. The bodies were never recovered. A cold knot formed in my stomach. My children were talking to the ghost of a murderer. That night I called a family meeting. Meredith rolled her eyes but humored me. "We need to stop talking to Albert," I said firmly, "and no more feeding him." Meredith sighed. "Ethan, this is ridiculous. It's just to be safe." Noah, who had been silent up until then, spoke up. "But he's nice," he said hesitantly. "He tells stories about the old days." My stomach twisted. Noah didn't believe in make-believe. He never had. If he had spoken to Albert, then Albert wasn't just a figment of Rosie's imagination. Rosie sniffled, her lower lip trembling. "But what if he gets hungry?" Ben curled into himself. "And what if the others come, the ones he warned us about?" A cold chill ran through me. "Listen, guys, I don't know what Albert really is, but we're not talking to him anymore. Rosie, you're going to sleep in the other room. We're leaving him alone. No more food, no more stories." Rosie burst into tears and ran from the room. Ben turned his face into the couch, shoulders shaking. Noah nodded stiffly but said nothing. That night, I poured a ring of salt around the closet. I didn't know what Albert was, but I knew without a doubt that he was real. For the first time since we moved in, the house felt heavier. Not in any tangible way, nothing had changed. Not really, but there was something lingering in the air, something I couldn't quite name. The salt circle around the closet gave me a small sense of control, but it didn't stop the unease from crawling under my skin. Rosie was furious with me. She sulked through dinner, barely touching her food, and refused to look in my direction. Ben was quieter than usual, sticking close to his sister, as if she was the only one who understood something the rest of us couldn't. Noah, ever the observer, kept his thoughts to himself, but I caught him watching me with an expression I couldn't decipher. That night I double-checked every lock before heading to bed. Meredith, exhausted from my so-called paranoia, had already fallen asleep. I climbed in beside her, my thoughts too restless to let me do the same. Sometime deep in the night I woke to a sound. A slow, deliberate creak, the unmistakable noise of a door opening. For a moment, I lay frozen, ears straining in the dark. Then, another sound, soft, cautious footsteps. I threw the covers off and swung my legs over the bed. The air in the room was colder than it should have been. Moving as quietly as possible, I reached for the baseball bat I kept propped against the wall. When I stepped into the hallway, I saw Rosie. She stood in front of her old bedroom, her small fingers gripping the doorknob. She wasn't moving, just standing there, staring at the door like she was waiting for it to open on its own. "Rosie," I whispered. She flinched but didn't turn around. "What are you doing?" I asked. Her voice was barely above a breath. "He's hungry." My skin prickled. I stepped forward, careful, measured. "Sweetheart, we talked about this. We can't." A sharp noise cut me off. A single, deliberate tap from inside the closet. Rosie's whole body tensed. "He says he understands," she whispered. "He's not mad." Something about the way she said it sent a shudder down my spine. I stepped in front of her and knelt down so we were eye level. "Rosie," I said gently, "I need you to go back to bed, right now." For a long moment, she didn't move. her wide, dark eyes locked onto mine, searching for something I didn't understand. Then, finally, she nodded. I walked her back to the room she now shared with Ben. He was already awake, sitting up in bed, his expression wary. I tucked Rosie in without another word, then quietly shut the door. As I turned back toward her old room, I hesitated. The hallway was silent. The house was old. Wood shifted, pipes groaned, foundations settled. It wasn't unusual to hear the occasional knock or creak in the night. That's all it was. I went back to bed. The next day, the wind had picked up, shaking the trees that bordered our property. The forecast called for a storm, but the air was oddly still despite the way the branches swayed. Ben and Noah spent the afternoon playing in the backyard, but Rosie refused to go outside. Instead, she lingered near the back windows, staring out toward the barn. I watched her from the kitchen, feeling the unease coil tighter in my gut. "Rosie," I finally said, setting my coffee down, "what are you looking at?" She didn't turn around. "It's watching." I frowned. "What is?" She pointed, her tiny finger barely touching the glass. "The thing Albert warned us about." The woods beyond the barn stood silent, dark even in the afternoon light. "There's nothing there, honey," I said, keeping my voice calm. "You know that, right?" She didn't respond. I walked over and knelt beside her. "Rosie," I said gently, "I need you to tell me the truth. Did Albert say something else to you?" She hesitated. Then, in a whisper, "He said it's coming closer." A chill ran through me. That night, the storm finally broke. The rain came hard, hammering against the roof. Thunder rolled in deep, distant waves, making the walls shudder. I lay awake listening, my mind unwilling to settle. Then, a sound. Not from inside the house this time. From the barn. A low creak, barely audible over the rain. I sat up. Meredith stirred beside me. "What is it?" she murmured. I thought I heard something. I swung my legs over the bed, rubbing my face. "It's the storm," she said, half asleep. But I wasn't convinced. The barn was old. Its doors had been warped by time and weather, and when the wind hit just right, they groaned in protest. But this sound had been deliberate, measured. I stood and walked to the window. The barn loomed in the darkness, its silhouette stark against the flashes of lightning. Something moved. Just for a second, a shape against the trees. I pressed my hand against the glass. The shape didn't move again. But somehow, I knew. It was watching. I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing I knew, I was being shaken awake. It was Noah. His face was pale, his hands gripping my arm tightly. "Dad," he whispered, urgent, "they're gone." It took me a second to process his words. "What?" "Ben and Rosie," he said, breathless. "They're gone." Every ounce of sleep vanished instantly. I threw the blankets off, my heart pounding as I bolted from the bed. The house was too quiet. I ran to their bedroom, throwing the door open. Empty. Sheets pulled back, window open. The storm had passed, but the wind still howled through the trees. I turned to Noah, who stood frozen in the doorway. "How long?" I demanded. Don't know," he stammered. "I woke up and—" I didn't wait. I ran. Through the hallway, down the stairs, out the back door. The night air hit me like ice. The forest stood dark and endless before me. Then, a sound. Music. faint, distant, threading through the trees like a whisper. Pipes, drums. I took off running. The ground was slick with rain, the underbrush grabbing at my legs as I pushed forward. The music grew louder, weaving through the wind, hypnotic and unnatural. And then I saw them. Ben and Rosie stood at the edge of the clearing, and in front of them, something else. A woman. She was impossibly tall, her dark hair cascading down her back. Her dress billowed like mist around her feet, untouched by the mud and leaves. She reached out a hand. Rosie moved first, stepping toward her. A scream cut through the night. A man's voice, raw with rage. Not again. Something barreled past me, a force like a cold wind, rushing toward the clearing. Albert. Except he wasn't just a man anymore. He was something more. The woman recoiled, her face twisting into something ancient and furious. Albert roared, his presence swelling, swallowing the light. And suddenly, the woman turned and vanished. Rosie and Ben collapsed where they stood. I rushed forward, dropping to my knees, shaking them, calling their names. They didn't respond. Albert stood over us, his form flickering like firelight. His voice was barely a whisper. I told you it wasn't safe. Then he was gone. And my children would not wake up. I carried my children back through the woods, their bodies limp in my arms, their skin cold as if the life had been drained from them. Noah trailed behind me, silent, his hands clenched into fists. The house had never felt farther away. Every step through the damp underbrush was a battle against the gnawing fear that I had already lost them. By the time I reached the back porch, my breath was coming in ragged gasps. I kicked open the door and hurried inside, setting them down gently on the living room couch. Their small chests rose and fell in shallow, slow breaths. Their eyes remained shut, their faces blank, expressionless. "Wake up," I whispered, shaking them. "Please, wake up." Nothing. I grabbed Ben's face between my hands, pressing my forehead to his. "Come back to me, buddy. Come on." Still nothing. Noah stood over them, arms wrapped around himself. "Is this because of her?" he asked, his voice tight. "Because of the woman?" I nodded, swallowing against the lump in my throat. "Yeah." "What was she?" I didn't have an answer for him. I didn't have answers for any of this. Footsteps sounded behind me, and I turned to see Meredith standing at the top of the stairs, her robe pulled tight around her. Her eyes flicked between our children and me, her face pale. "Ethan," she said slowly, "what the hell is going on?" I opened my mouth, but before I could speak, the air shifted. A cold whisper slithered through the house, curling around us like smoke. A shape stood in the hallway. Albert. He wasn't flickering this time, wasn't half there like before. He was solid, as real as any living man. His suspenders stretched across his broad frame, his thinning blonde hair clinging to his forehead. But the hole in his skull was still there, a jagged, gaping wound, a hollow reminder of the violence that had taken him. He looked at me, his expression grave. "They're not gone yet," he said. I swallowed hard. "Then help me bring them back." Albert stepped closer. "I can hold the folk off for now," he said, "but they already have a piece of them. Their spirits are stuck between here and there. If we don't act fast, they'll slip away for good." Meredith sucked in a sharp breath. "Ethan," she whispered, "who is this?" "Albert," I said, and she stared at me like I'd lost my mind. Albert ignored her, turning his attention to the children. He crouched beside the couch, placing a cold, ghostly hand over Rosie's forehead. She reached out first, he murmured. She was willing. I clenched my jaw. Then how do we get them back? Albert didn't answer right away. He looked up at me, his single remaining eye dark with something unreadable. You won't like it, he said. I don't care. He exhaled, nodding. You need iron, he said. Pure iron. Something to anchor their souls here while I pull them back. Meredith, still looking lost in the chaos of it all, blinked. Iron? Noah's head snapped up. The statues, he said suddenly. I turned to him. What? Mom's statues, he said, his voice rising with urgency. The ones she made. The ones with iron inside them. Meredith sucked in a breath. They're in their rooms. I was already moving before she finished the sentence, sprinting up the stairs 2 at a time. I tore through their bedrooms, grabbing each of the small sculptures Meredith had made, the tiger for Noah, the monkey for Ben, the rabbit for Rosie. I clutched them tight, feeling the weight of them, the solidness of the iron buried within. By the time I got back downstairs, Albert was still crouched beside the children, his hands outstretched above them, his lips moving in soundless words. The air in the room felt heavier, charged. Here, I said, shoving the statues into his hands. Albert took them carefully, pressing each one to the children's chests. This will help, he said, but I need you to call them back. They need to hear your voice. I knelt down, my hands shaking. Ben, I murmured. Rosie, it's Dad. You have to come back. You have to wake up. Nothing. Come on, you guys, Noah said, stepping beside me. You can't just leave like this. A long silence stretched between us. Then Rosie stirred. A small sound left her lips. Her fingers twitched, curling slightly. Rosie, I breathed. That's it, sweetheart. Come back. Ben shuddered, a sharp breath escaping his lips. Then, all at once, their eyes snapped open. Rosie gasped, sitting up so fast that she nearly smacked into me. Her hands grasped at my arms, her little fingers digging into my skin. Dad, she whispered, her voice trembling. She was calling us. Ben blinked rapidly, looking dazed. I don't remember, he mumbled. I just remember the music. Relief crashed over me so hard I nearly collapsed. I pulled them both into my arms, holding them so tight they squeaked in protest. It's okay, I murmured. You're home. You're safe. When I finally pulled back, I turned to Albert. He was standing now, watching us with an expression I couldn't quite name. The edges of him were beginning to blur, his form flickering. Thank you, I said, meaning it more than I ever had before. Albert gave me a small, tired smile. You're a good father, he said. You did what I couldn't. A deep sadness clung to his words. I wanted to say something else, but before I could, he was gone. The weight in the room lifted. The air settled. It was over. We left the house a week later. I didn't care that we had just moved in, didn't care about the money we were losing. The moment I saw my children's faces pale in fear every time they looked toward the woods, I knew we had to go. Meredith didn't fight me on it. We never spoke of Albert again, not really. Every now and then, Noah would ask a quiet question, his voice tinged with curiosity, but I never had good answers. Some things weren't meant to be understood. Before we left, I walked up to Rosie's old bedroom one last time. The closet door stood open. The salt line had been disturbed, the faint outline of a footprint breaking the circle. I stepped inside, placing a single glass of whiskey on the floor. Thank you, I whispered. A breeze passed through the room, stirring my hair. rustling the edges of my shirt. I closed the door, and for the first time in months, I felt at peace. We never saw Albert again. But I'd like to think, wherever he was, he finally found his peace too.